As a 49ers fan living in Philadelphia, playing my brother who had George Kittle, week 4 was my own personal version of hell. But we will try and be better in week 5 to bring you a win on the Radio.com Sports Fantasy Football Show. But who the F is Travis Fulgham? That was cleansing. Welcome again to the Radio.com Sports Fantasy Football Show. My name is Steven Andrus, joined by two members of our Radio.com Sports staff, Jordan Cohn and Jesse Pantusco. It is week 5. We are past the quarter pole of the fantasy football season, and we will bring you, as always, Waiver Wire and Pick 'em Up, streaming starts, and also Stealthy starts in this episode. Let's start with Waiver Wire, and in week number 4, a couple more running back injuries to try and navigate. Nick Chubb left the game early with a knee injury against Dallas. That makes Ernest Johnson a possible waiver wire pickup this week if Chubb is out. At the time of this recording, he is undergoing an MRI on Monday, so something to monitor there. If he is out, Ernest Johnson is a viable option off the waiver wire. Against Dallas, 13 carries, 95 yards. That went alongside of Kareem Hunt's 11 carries for 71 yards and 2 touchdowns. This is a viable offense with 2 running backs weekly. They're the most run-heavy offense in the NFL, running it at 53% of the time, so keep an eye on Chubb's health. The other major injury in week 4 was Chargers running back Austin Eckler. Again, at the time of this recording, Adam Schefter reporting that Eckler is going to miss multiple weeks with knee and hamstring injuries. Joshua Kelley becomes an option, Justin Jackson in deeper leagues as well. Kelley owned in less than 60% of leagues is the priority if Eckler is out. In the week 4 matchup, the breakdown was Joshua Kelley playing 58% of the snaps, getting 9 carries and 3 targets. Justin Jackson, 38% of the snaps, 6 carries and 2 targets. It's a tough matchup in week 5 against New Orleans, but if you're desperate for a running back, one of these guys could be a viable option for you to get into your starting lineup. At least should be rostered in all leagues moving forward. Jordan, you have another guy here who might be ascending up the depth chart here in the coming weeks without an injury.
Yeah, well, Kenyon Drake did leave the game with a chest injury. We're not sure of the significance, but either way, you should monitor that health. But also, Drake's performance this year has just been underwhelming week in and week out, making Chase Edmonds someone to keep your eye out on and snag from the waiver wire if he's not owned already. Drake is averaging 3.8 yards per carry this season as opposed to 5.2 last year. On the year as a whole, he has 5 catches for 20 yards, which is what I wanted him to get on a weekly basis. Meanwhile, Edmonds has 13 catches, 73 yards, 2 touchdowns on the season, meaning that he's more stable as a receiver even when Drake is healthy. When Drake isn't healthy, which might be the case on a temporary basis, Edmonds is going to become a must-start player, especially with good matchups coming up against the Jets and the Cowboys. Last year, when Edmonds took over the starting role, he casually went off for 126 yards and 3 scores in David Johnson's absence. So Chase Edmonds is someone to look out for, and he even has some decent standalone value when Drake is in as a receiver.
Jesse, I loved Blake Jarwin at the beginning of the year. He went out with an early season-ending injury. I'm going to take your pick here as my victory lap on Blake Jarwin and count it.
Yeah, I'm talking about Cowboys tight end Dalton Schultz. You're probably thinking it's hard enough for an NFL team to support 3 pass catchers. 4 would be next to impossible. To which I would say, have you seen the Cowboys this year? Dak Prescott is on pace to shatter NFL records in passing yards, completions, and pass attempts. He's averaging over 50 attempts per game. This is unheard of volume. Since taking over the starting role from Jarwin, who tore his ACL in the opener, Schultz has averaged 69.3 receiving yards per game. If Schultz kept that up over a full season, he'd finish with over 1,100 yards. He's also scored a touchdown in 2 of his last 3 games. As long as the Cowboys are in shootouts, Schultz will keep putting up tight end 1 numbers, even in a crowded offense with Amari Cooper, CeeDee Lamb, Ezekiel Elliott, and Michael Gallup.
Yeah, I don't think that defense is getting better anytime soon either, so I love the pick. Let's move on to the stream team for week 5. This is our top quarterback, tight end, and defensive streamer owned in less than 50% of leagues that you can pick up and start in week number 5 based on the matchup. And let's start at quarterback.
Yeah, I'm going to go with Justin Herbert this week. Speaking of historic numbers, He just joined Cam Newton as the only rookie quarterback in history to surpass 900 passing yards in his first 3 career games since 1970. The Austin Eckler injury doesn't exactly help him, as that's a key target that's being taken away, but at the same time, it probably puts more of the burden, more of the load on Herbert's shoulders. And he has the Saints in week 5, which could mean that he's passing and playing catch up, as no one has been able to contain Alvin Kamara, and that offense is looking pretty good, even with Breeze struggles a little bit. But anyway, their defense hasn't been that great anyway against the pass. They surrendered 240 yards and 2 scores to Brady, 280 and 3 scores to Carr, 280 and 3 scores to Rodgers, and another 3 scores to Stafford yesterday. I don't know why that shouldn't be a reasonable basis for Herbert's projection next week. One thing you should keep an eye on is the status of their cornerbacks, as Marshawn Lattimore and Janoris Jenkins missed week 4. If either one of those guys is out in week 5, that even bolsters Herbert's case as a streaming option.
Yeah, if the Saints jump out to a big lead, you'll have negative game script, maybe some garbage time. I like the option there. I got tight ends. It's tough on them streaming tight end streets this year, as it has been in recent years. But I like Eric Ebron from the Pittsburgh Steelers off that quasi-COVID-induced bye week for Pittsburgh when they're supposed to play the Titans last week. In week 3, before that bye, 5 catches, 52 yards, and a touchdown on 7 targets for Ebron against the Houston Texans. He gets the Eagles in week number 5. The Eagles are allowing the 3rd most points per week to tight ends this season, and the most touchdowns this year to tight ends with 5. George Kittle smashed them. Tyler Higbee scored 3 times. Even Logan Thomas of Washington scored on the Eagles in week number 1. They are just decimated at linebacker this year. They don't have a great secondary on top of that. So tight ends are doing very well against the Eagles this season. That is my top streaming tight end option for week number 5. How about defense, Jesse?
By the way, I like your pick because Hawkinson, who I touted last week, scored a touchdown too. The Saints seem to be the new tight end flowchart team. But yeah, back to defenses. This one might come as a little bit of a head scratcher after the Browns allowed 38 points and over 500 passing yards to Dak Prescott in week 4. But when it comes to fantasy defenses, all we care about are turnovers. And right now, Cleveland leads the NFL in takeaways with 10. They had 3 against Dallas, including 2 fumble recoveries. Their opponent this week, the Colts, have a much healthier and arguably better offensive line than Dallas. Don't forget who their quarterback is. Only Jameis Winston committed more turnovers than Phillip Rivers last year. He's already thrown 3 interceptions this year and nearly had a 4th Sunday that was overturned on review. We know the Colts like to lean heavily on their ground game, but with the Browns averaging 39 points over their last 3 games, they may not have that luxury this week. If the Colts fall behind and have to abandon the run, I think the Browns can probably bait Rivers into a couple turnovers and maybe even a pick 6.
Good stuff, Jesse. Let's move on to stealthy starts for week number 5. These are players that in recent weeks have been started in less than 50% of leagues that we like the matchups for in week number 5. And we begin with a preseason hype train running back that should be a little bit more viable in week number 5.
Yeah, slowly but surely, Antonio Gibson's role is increasing. There's concern Gibson might max out as a gadget player in the NFL. That's essentially how he was used in college. But Gibson saw workhorse usage Sunday against Baltimore, turning 17 touches into a career-high 128 yards from scrimmage. Gibson was vultured twice by Peyton Barber in week 1, but he's had a monopoly on goal line carries ever since, scoring in each of his last 3 games. Game script often works against running backs when a team is playing from behind, which will probably be the case for Washington against the Rams in week 5. But because of his receiving ability, Gibson might actually benefit from that scenario. He caught 4 balls for 82 receiving yards Sunday, the most by a Washington running back since Chris Thompson in 2018. Now that he's established a relatively safe floor, I think Gibson could be in for a breakout week against a Rams defense that has allowed 4.99 yards per carry to opposing rushers.
Jordan, you have a rookie running back as well here for stealthy starts.
Yeah, I do. And look, I would feel much more comfortable starting Gibson than my own choice this week, admittedly. But given the decimation of the running back position across the fantasy football landscape, you might be in a little bit of a pickle. And J.K. Dobbins here is someone who you might be able to plug and play and have a solid week out of. He started off his rookie season with a promising start, 2 goal line touchdowns against the Browns in week 1. Since then, he has done next to nothing in terms of his fantasy value. but a game against the Bengals in week 5 promises a good game script. Look, last year, the Ravens were up 49-10 against the Bengals at the end of the third quarter, and that's where Gus Edwards and Justice Hill were getting a lot of carries. I expect a similar result this year. Gus Edwards is probably his biggest obstacle to having a viable fantasy week, but Dobbins has been a solid figure in the receiving game. He had 4 catches for 40 yards in week 2. And in the past 3 weeks, the Bengals have allowed 4 different running backs to surpass 100 yards from scrimmage, meaning that a lot of different pieces are getting involved on a lot of different teams. And we could see Dobbins, Ingram, and Edwards all see a pretty good role in those week 5 matchup.
I have a stealthy wide receiver start for you this week, and maybe a stealthy wide receiver 1 for his team for the rest of the season. I'll give you the numbers, let you decide. Robby Anderson of the Carolina Panthers started in less than half of leagues last week, but he might just be the Panthers' number 1 wide receiver over DJ Moore. So far this season, Anderson has out-targeted Moore 34-32. Anderson has 8+ targets in 3 of 4 games this season, 99+ yards in those games with 8+ targets. Double-digit PPR points every week this season, and he gets Atlanta in week 5. Through the first 3 weeks of the year, Atlanta was top 5 in fantasy points allowed to wide receivers. They allowed more than 10 yards per target. Not reception, 10 yards per target. They are bleeding points to wide receivers. I love Robby Anderson, not only for this week, but moving forward, I think you can confidently start him as at least the flex for the rest of the season with this Panthers team that is going to be pass heavy. They're going to have teams that can score on their defense. It's going to lead to negative game scripts. And Jesse, you mentioned before we started recording this show, they got the Temple connection with Matt Rule. He coached him at Temple, so he's fitting in nicely in that Carolina offense. A rare case where we see a wide receiver changing teams in the offseason and performing extremely well. All right, everybody, thank you so much for joining us on this week's episode of the Radio.com Sports Fantasy Football Show. As always, check us out on YouTube if you aren't already. And if you have a fantasy football question for week 5, you can leave it in the YouTube comments, and we'll be happy to answer it for you this week. Best of luck in week number 5. For Jesse Pantusco, I'm Jordan, you're Jordan Cohn, and I'm Steven Andress. We'll see you in week number 6.